you're just seeing the PowerPoint slide. You're not seeing any of my Microsoft Word notes or anything.
Correct.
Correct.
No.
Okay, good, because, all right.
Got to have those presenter tools. That's the only way to do it. PowerPoint.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'll play around a little bit here, but I think I'm in better shape than I was last week. I just got a little discombobulated there with the tech.
Greg, are you going to start with it on the PowerPoint?
That was the idea.
Okay.
That meets with precedent and convention and agreement.
You're more than welcome to do it as you wish.
All right. Okay. Well, we'll go with what you see there.
Why don't you start with your stuff?
I would suspect that we are close enough to 9:45 that the crowd has arrived that is going to be here. And so let us welcome back Greg Snyder, professor of religion at Davidson College, for the third version or component of his Render Under Caesar series for us at the Covenant class. And today the emphasis is the Divided by Faith book by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith. And thank you, Greg, and take it away.
Sure. Thanks, Van. And thanks everyone for being here. Let me see if somehow my camera slipped. Adjust something there. All these presentation variables. Have you found the automatic touch-up setting on Zoom? There's a setting under the controls that apparently kind of photoshops you slightly to look more appealing. So go, if the presentation slows down and you drift off, maybe you can go explore that particular setting and
I see them.
have yourself have your look improved technologically, electronically. So anyhow, well, this is it's good to be with everyone today. Thank you all for being here. And this is the third installment in these 4 books that I've been using in my class. And this one, you can see here, this is called Divided by Faith, and it's by, before I get started, let's just say, just by way of entree, let me just say a brief word of prayer to get us going, if that's all right. All right. Gracious God, thank you for the opportunity to meet this morning, to reflect on matters that are important in our personal lives, in our social lives, in our church lives, and in the lives of the folks we live with in this town. Give us your wisdom and insight, we pray. Amen. All right. So, picking up. Book today is Divided by Faith. It's by Michael Emerson and Christian Smith. And I mentioned, I think at the beginning, that the different books that we're looking at are all in very different genres. The first one, Philip Gorski, is a little more, I would say, philosophical and political science in its nature, follows a historical narrative. Last week, we looked at Kevin Cruz's book, One Nation Under God, and that is a very historical piece of work looking at the making of religion in American society ever since the middle of the 20th century, and sees that as kind of a reaction to FDR's New Deal policies by certain economic and theological constituencies in American society. This book this week is very much sociological in its approach. And the authors are both sociologists of religion, and their approach, we'll see, is quantitative. This whole book is really based on a couple of different surveys, one of which they did, in which they called and spoke with and interviewed something like 2,000 evangelical Christians. And then based on those phone interviews, actually did visits to some 200 of these folks to explore the answers in greater detail. And then they arranged the results of the surveys in sort of columns and tables and percentages and standard deviations and all that kind of stuff that sociologists like, because it makes things quantitative and it seems to approach something like scientific proof, even though I think, as we all know, when you're talking about people, they don't necessarily fit in all the boxes. Nevertheless, they're really working hard to make this as quantitative as possible. So the two authors, Michael Emerson and Christian Smith, nowadays, Michael Emerson is at the University of Illinois in Chicago. Christian Smith, when he contributed to this volume, was at Chapel Hill, but now he's at Notre Dame University. And they've gone on to very illustrious careers in sociology and religion, and they're continuing to work in this field. Christian Smith has written a bunch of books. Michael Emerson also has written further studies and is involved in a very large scale follow-up study to this book, Divided by Faith. So hopefully within a year or so, we'll see something like a 20-year anniversary version of Divided by Faith. This book was published in the year 2000, so it's a little bit dated in certain respects. I think the term evangelical has undergone some changes since this book was written. Anyhow, so the subtitle of the book, Evangelical Religion: The Problem of Race in America. So this is the focal point of the book, is evangelical religion and how it contributes to, as they will make clear, in spite of its best intentions, why evangelical religion is actually part of the problem rather than part of the solution when it comes to the racialization of American society. And that's what they're exploring. So a couple of definitions just of terms. So, and let me also say, in the past couple of weeks, in the attempt to describe the books in some detail, I feel like I've gone on to the very end of the session and maybe precluded conversation. I want to try to get through things in a timelier way and give us more opportunity to talk about things and to hear from you, and not just at me monologuing here from the Zoom podium. And particularly on this issue, right? I think this is something a lot of us care about. A lot of us have experienced here locally or in different venues. And so I really do want to hear from you, and I think we would all benefit from hearing from each other. So I do want to try to get through things a little more briskly and give us time to talk amongst ourselves. So first off, just a couple quick definitions. Their functioning definition of evangelical has certain characteristics to it. For them, evangelicals believe in the final and ultimate authority that is the Bible. It doesn't necessarily translate into sort of hardcore inerrantism, right? So I think it would be a broader category than commitment to the Bible being historically, scientifically, morally, ethically, theologically true in every point of detail. I think it's a broader category than that. Evangelicals believe that Christ dies for all, that his death is efficacious for the salvation of all. They emphasize the importance of being born again. That's a fundamental rhetorical trope in evangelical religion. There is a focus on evangelizing, on taking this message to the larger society. and that evangelicals in general want to engage the larger culture. They're not sort of bunkered down in their own closed off society. There is some sense in which they want to reach out. And Billy Graham would be a pretty good example of an evangelical. And I remember actually last week throwing out Billy Graham as a diagnostic example. And for some reason, John, I associate this with you, that Billy Graham is a good diagnostic for separating a fundamentalist from an evangelical. Is that right? Am I remembering that correctly?
Yeah, that's right. There's a really nice line in one of Marty's books, which says, if you want to sort out a fundamentalist from an evangelical, ask them what they think of Billy Graham. And if they say he's the best thing since sliced bread, then you got yourself an evangelical. If you say, well, you know, he's a little soft on inerrancy and blah, 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 you got a fundamentalist.
Yeah. So I think that's true. I think that's particularly true. One of the things that we saw last week in Cruz's book is Billy Graham kind of definitely, he sort of evolves over his career. In his early stages, we saw that he was theologically and in some ways socially fairly open, but from a political and economic standpoint, very conservative. But at later stages in his career, he did want to stand apart from some evangelical and fundamentalist movements like the moral majority and so forth, right? So he took a somewhat independent path. But Billy Graham, they think of as an example of a classic evangelical. Let me see here. Why now? Oh, there we go. Okay. So when talking about matters of race, they depart from using the word racist, right? I think racist as a term has a kind of a sharpness, but also an individual character to it that they want to avoid. So when they talk about social realities and society at large, the authors tend to use the term racialized society, and this is how they would define it. A racialized society is a society wherein race matters profoundly for differences in life experiences, life opportunities, and social relationships. It's a society that allocates differential economic, political, social, and even psychological rewards to groups along racial lines that are socially constructed. So they will, this is the fundamental definition that they use. In teaching this book to students, that seemed to be kind of a helpful distinction, right? When you think of racists and racism and so forth, it's easy to think of, you know, white power groups and the Ku Klux Klan and neo-Nazis and Proud Boys and so forth as being examples of racists. And it's harder to apply those categories to yourself. But if you think about category of racialization, that's easier to think in terms of things are just divided up this way. And it's not the case that racialization has to feature any sort of overt extrinsic racism. It doesn't necessarily have to have any personal animus or intention. Instead, racializing practices, and I think this may be on my next slide here. Let me see. Racializing practices, as they say, are one, often covert, two, embedded in normal operations of institutions, three, they tend to avoid direct racial terminology, and four, are invisible to most whites. So post George Floyd and post summer of 2020, I think a word that has cropped up a lot with respect to racism is systemic racism, right? That's very much now in the national lexicon. That wasn't as such used back in the year 2000 when this book was published, but what they're talking about here is very much the same thing as systemic racism. So I think talking about racialization and systemic racism are pretty much the same thing. So next here. So there is a, let me see just what I've got here in my chapters. I've got things organized. So I'm going to skip ahead just a little bit here because I'm a little bit out of order. So after giving these definitions in chapter 3 of the book, they spend a good amount of time doing a historical review of race in American society from the very beginnings up until basically the civil rights era. And I'm gonna just not step through all of this, right? It's actually, I think, a pretty good summary going from slavery in the pre-colonial period to the colonial period, and then to the antebellum period before the Civil War. And it charts all the kind of the different thinking about how enslaved people related to Christianity. In the initial stages, there really wasn't much emphasis on trying to preach the gospel to enslaved people or integrating them into churches and theological structures. That changed at a certain point in time, really in the sort of the revolutionary period. All this talk, it seems like, about freedom and being enslaved to Great Britain made people reflect a little bit more on the practice of slavery and whether that was a good thing. The abolition movement starts to arise at this point in time. You also get some Quakers like John Woolman starting to write in reaction to the practice of slavery. So this is, some proto-abolition movements starting to arise. Then in the beginning of the 19th century, in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s, you get people like William Lloyd Garrison and more full-on abolitionist movement starting to arise. And then you also get some Southern apologists for slavery, people who are arguing for the practice of slavery, not just as a necessary evil, but as a positive good based on scriptural texts and theological principles and so forth. So they talk about all of this. They talk about the period of Reconstruction and Jim Crow and so forth. And a lot of you will know a good bit about that. You should have Professor Kirkendall come back and do a series on that. Would probably be the best thing to get into that. So then they take it up to the civil rights period, and then in chapter 4, they talk about particularly evangelical responses to the civil rights movement. They talk about certain characters, Tony Evans, John Perkins. Have many of you heard of John Perkins? He was a pastor in Jackson, Mississippi, who was, very intentionally kind of related himself to evangelical groups like Charles Colson's group, right? Whatever Colson's group, Colson, after sort of running into a brick wall there with Nixon and Watergate and all of that, went off to prison and came out both evangelical, but also very oriented to social concerns and prison reform and working with prisoners and so forth. So there were some white Protestant groups, evangelical groups, that were also more attuned to social injustice and things. So there are groups like that. And John Perkins was a Black pastor in Mississippi who tried to make relationships with groups like that. And it was interesting that I actually met Perkins, I think it was in 1976 or something like that. My relatively mellow evangelical church in Boulder, Colorado, sent a van load of high school students down to Jackson, Mississippi to hang out with Perkins and do some volunteer labor and catch a little bit of his message. So we did that and actually got to meet Perkins and be a part of that ministry for a little while. And now, so it's fun now to come back and see him referred to in this book. And he stayed active in that kind of work. There are other evangelical groups, one of which is Promise Keepers. Promise Keepers, does that sound familiar to people? They were a big deal, I think, back in the 90s. Bill McCartney, who's actually represented on this slide here, was the head football coach of the Colorado Buffaloes at the University of Colorado. And he took that sports notoriety and leadership and channel it into the Promise Keeper movement, which was a very evangelical movement that was focused on, I suppose, family life, and particularly on the Christian or godly identity of the husband and the father and the male, basically leader within the household. And it was a kind of I guess it was a sort of a Protestant evangelical male spirituality revival. And there was at one point the Million Man March on Washington, D.C. I think that was 1997, and Promise Keepers were a big part of that. And they made many attempts to, I think, reach out to groups like John Perkins and Carl Ellis, Tony Evans, and other such people who were trying to cross this boundary within evangelical religion that seemed to divide races. And so a good chunk of this book talks about the Promise Keepers and their way of sort of trying to reconcile racial difficulties. And McCartney is quoted a good bit. And so this is getting to the end of chapter 4 now, when McCartney would go out and they would do these stadium rallies. They would go to stadiums and they would, get 10, 20, 30, 40,000 people out there. And one of the things that they would do is they would explicitly try to address racial division and divides and invite people from different races to meet, to fellowship, to pray, to interact with each other right there in the context of these sort of Protestant revivals, almost evangelical revivals. But McCartney reflected that systematically that this was, even though there was some, I think, effervescence and success, that it seemed like, at least at a superficial level, it is a sustained teaching that this was hard to maintain, and that the racial message remains a highly charged element of Promise Keepers ministry. He said that's actually a direct quote. It is simply hard teaching for many. So trying to press this in this evangelical venue was difficult, as McCartney himself realizes. And I spent some time looking up the Promise Keepers on the web, and they're still a pretty vital and going concern. McCartney seems to have edged out. I don't know if that's just because he aged out or what was going on, but they're planning, I think, some large stadium type revival here in the year 2021. Their leadership seems to have changed a little bit. They seem to be kind of tracking now with the political version of modern evangelicals. So the current leader of it, Ken Harrison, I know, he's featured on the website as being a guest in many national news outlets, including Fox News and the Huckabee Show, and some of the classic 700 Club, PTL, and some of these classic evangelical media venues that I think have taken on a more of a political identity and swung in a direction of supporting our current president. So I think Promise Keepers has probably charted a certain progression in the identity of evangelicals in America, and it's more explicitly right-wing kind of approach that Franklin Graham has probably embodied in that way, departing from very much from Billy Graham. So anyhow, that was really chapter 4. And at the end of chapter 24, they put up what I think is a really helpful thing called a cultural toolkit that they based on the writings of a sociologist, Ann Swidler. A cultural toolkit they define as a way to organize experiences and evaluate reality. Cultural toolkit provides a repertoire or toolkit of ideas, habits, skills, and styles, according to Swidler's article. And if you bring this idea of the cultural toolkit to bear on American evangelicals, Emerson and Smith find three chief tools. One is accountable free will individualism. The second tool is relationalism, which is attaching central importance to interpersonal relationships. And three, anti-structuralism, an inability to perceive or unwillingness to accept social structural influences. Let's see here. And one of the things, and this just is a bit of a caveat, as they did their interviews and spoke with people, they really, as they say here, wanted to give people the benefit of the doubt. They didn't think that the folks that they interviewed, these pious and well-intentioned evangelicals, were somehow misrepresenting how they actually or really felt. And as they say here in this quotation, we move beyond the simplistic explanation that white evangelicals, to protect their advantages, simply lie or distort the truth. We cannot conclude that their expressed views are merely smokescreens to divert attention from what they know to be true. Instead, we have argued the cultural tools, like the ones we just mentioned, and intergroup isolation of evangelicals lead them to construct reality so as to individualize and minimize the problem. They do so honestly and with good intentions, even if somewhat one-sidedly. So these cultural tools that evangelicals are deploying are sort of deployed in good faith. And I know that all of these cultural tools, they seem intimately familiar from my own upbringing and background, and I suppose they'll look somewhat familiar to you as well. So having laid out this background of history and a little bit of sociology and anthropology when it comes to these cultural toolkits, they pick out a couple different sight lines along which they interview these 2,000 people that they interview, and then the 200 in which they do personal interviews. So the next chapter, chapter 5, is on economic mobility, right? This is actually going to be of interest to, I think I might have seen Steve Justice somewhere down the column there when it comes down to things like the North Mech income equality or mobility cooperative. Now I'm blanking on the words, but this is relevant to to that question.
Hey, Greg.
Yeah.
Greg.
Break in, please.
Go back up to the toolkit again. I don't believe I understood the first one.
Let me see here. Hold on.
There you go. Accountable free will individualism means what?
It means an emphasis on personal choice, and that the individual is a rational free agent that chooses, more or less apart from any gravitational fields or pulls that might affect their free choice.
Okay. And accountable means they do it freely, but other people will stand in, evaluate.
Well, it means that they are sort of theologically accountable for those choices, and that from the standpoint of, divine punishment, they merit what they get.
Okay.
And in a sense, and I hadn't really thought about this until I had a conversation with a student, that the narrative portrayal of Adam actually captures this in a very crystalline way, right? You have Adam and Eve in the garden making a choice about whether to eat this thing, this fruit that they've been forbidden or not. And now, granted, as the story goes, sort of Eve gives the fruit to Adam, and patriarchal culture, I think, has tended to blame Eve and her feminine wiles for sort of softening Adam's rational and agential elements of free choosing. But finally, Adam chooses, and he makes the wrong choice. He knows it's the wrong choice, and he suffers the consequences. And that is like a picture of accountable free will individualism in action. And as a result, they're thrown out of the garden. they suffer the consequences. And I don't know, that's, I think, a nice capture of what that means.
That's great. Thank you.
Greg,
Sure.
Greg, economically, is it meritocracy, Horatio Alger, bootstraps? And theologically, it's going to hell? Is that what number
Yeah,
one
I mean,
is?
it's definitely, there's definitely a strong meritocratic element to it, that, you know, you get what you deserve, you get what you work for, and that there's an abiding assumption on the part of these folks that American society, the American economy, is a flat playing field, and that everyone is on the same level when it comes to race and the ability to rise or fall. If that answers the question. So, let me see here. Okay, we got this. So the next chapter, and maybe this goes to your question, Steve. It's a little more when it comes to economics, question of economic mobility. The question that they asked these people they interviewed, on average, they say blacks have worse jobs, worse income, worse housing than white people. And do you think this is because, and then they gave people 4 different options. 1, blacks have less inborn ability to learn. 2, because most blacks just don't have the motivation or willpower to pull themselves up out of poverty. You know, they don't have that Horatio Alger kind of, you know, giddy up. 3, because most blacks don't have a chance for education that it takes to rise out of poverty. Or 4, mainly due to discrimination. And what they found, I think I got on my next slide here, is they would find that most Americans, well, let me see, hold on. I think I got that on the next slide. They found that if you break this up into the 3 different tools, that most Americans would give answers that can kind of be explained, you know, based on the individualistic character of American society. But what they found is that self-confessed Protestant evangelicals, conservative Protestant evangelicals, tended statistically to show a very noticeable increase or difference from, you know, sort of the main group of Americans who don't have that kind of affiliation. So most Americans and most Protestant evangelicals were reluctant to say, you know, yeah, blacks have a less inborn ability to learn, right? No one tended to favor that as an example, although something like 10% of people did offer that as an example, which even that, you know, 1 out of 10, I think is very high. And similarly, the answer that most blacks just don't have the motivation, the willpower, there was a sort of a higher incidence of that answer, but that too was relatively low. But when it came down to some of the statistics on these answers, half of white Americans cite a lack of access to good education as a factor, whereas only 1/3 of evangelical Protestants do, right? Most Americans, most white Americans were willing to say the reason why black people don't succeed economically is because of this structural factor of, you know, they don't have access to good education. Only 1/3 of evangelical Protestants were willing to admit to that. So 2/3 of evangelical Protestants are looking for other explanations. So that's a statistically meaningful difference between white Americans at large and white evangelical Protestants. So white evangelical Protestants are less willing to admit this structural factor. So on the question of explicit, systematic social discrimination, 1/3 of Americans chalk up economic disparity to such discrimination, whereas only 1/4 of Protestant evangelicals do. So again, there's a noticeable statistical difference between white Americans generally and white Protestant evangelicals explicitly. And you can also, I mean, you can also imagine that the half of what, or the, the 1/3 of Americans that chalk up economic disparity to discrimination, you could very easily believe that white America generally is still influenced very much by white evangelical culture, even if those people who are giving those answers, in that category of white Americans that don't explicitly say believe evangelical doctrines or subscribe to evangelical tenets anymore, they're still very much influenced by that tenor of American culture. So I would say even on that larger group of white Americans generally, you still have the influence of American evangelical culture influencing the answers that they give.
Greg,
Yeah.
is that from the book written in 2000, or is that recent?
No, this is all based on this book written in 2000. It would be interesting to to bring this up to date. And in fact, and I think, let me see, hold on, if I've got a slide that's coming up that actually I wrote. It's on the subject of progress. So if just sort of hold that question, Pam, for 1 second. It's kind of interesting, but I'll just trot through a couple of these other tools. So that somehow bears on the accountable free will individualism tool. The relationalism tool also gets into the answers that white Protestant evangelicals tend to give. And this is just, again, I just excerpt something that Emerson is going to say. Black individuals are seen as doing poorly economically because their families lack strong bonds or because significant others do not steer them to make right choices. One congregational woman told us, I see the breakup of the family as being the key to the whole thing, just the non-blessedness of the people. For those who are poor, I think it's because, for those who are not poor, I think it's because they have been in Christian families, right? So this, and you hear this, right, in church circles and evangelical circles. Well, the reason, it's the disruption of the family. It's because they don't have good family relationships that, they suffer these disadvantages. And that in Christian families are by definition, families that stay together, that have traditional roles between, males and females, right? Those kinds of families are going to produce people who are better able to succeed. So this relationalism tool gets in there. And then also the anti-structuralism tool also comes in, that government is actually to blame, government solutions. By trying to solve individual level problems with social programs, the government is not only foolish, but as one Presbyterian woman put it, creating a system no different from slavery. Another woman, a member of an Assembly of God church, states it has to be blamed on the government, this problem. The government makes it easier for somebody to sit home and collect welfare and have baby after baby. So these little excerpts actually are illustrative of the book, because this part of the book is actually very rich in personal anecdotes. They relate a lot of the substance of these interviews, and what these folks said is the reason why Black Americans are able to advance. And it's interesting just to observe how people kind of sort of shift and twist a little bit because they don't want to admit or come off as explicitly racist. But again, the kind of explanations that they give really start in a more transparent way, show the racialization of society and the racialization of their own thinking when it comes to these kinds of explanations. And I think, hold on, I'm looking for, oh, well, Pam, I must have somehow cut out the slide that I was going for, because it was sort of on the subject of progress. Oh yeah, this was it. This is what I was going for. So Pam, to your question, this study that they did was in the year 2000, and there was one interesting. This is in the historical analysis chapter, going all the way back to 1835. Alexis de Tocqueville predicted that if and when slaves were freed, the black-white divide would grow only more intense. And they mentioned the authors of the book, Emerson and Smith, the 1968 President's Commission on Race and American Society. I think it was the Kerner Commission or something like that, which came to the conclusion that fundamentally blacks and whites are two separate societies. That was in 1968. And then in 1993, the Eisenhower Foundation did a 25-year follow-up on that study. The US is two societies, one black, one white, separate and unequal. More true in 1993, they said, than it was in 1968. And then Emerson and Smith were basically writing in the wake of this study. And I actually wrote to Emerson and Smith to find out, any updates and what's going on. And Emerson has himself got a very large grant to do sort of a follow-up study. And what Emerson himself told me in an email is that the study we're now conducting, right as of this moment in 2020, that they hope to complete next year, is the follow-up to Divided by Faith, to see what has changed and what has stayed the same. Sadly, we find most things have stayed the same, except in areas where we find a wider gap than 20 years ago. So that's Michael Emerson commenting on the state of affairs as of about a month ago. So, that's the progress that we've been making or not been making, as the case may be. So let me catch back up to where we will. Okay, so anti-structural. So getting into chapter 6, good heavens, 1024. I realize I'm failing in my resolution to not be talking too much. Does anyone want to chip in with anything? Let me just create a little space if folks want to get in and offer a contribution or reflect on anything.
Greg,
Yeah.
This is Charlie.
Hey, Charlie.
Thanks for listening. Talking and helping me think, us think. I'm concerned at some point to go back to Steve Justice's question of what is justice in the New Testament. And I need some help getting there from this toolkit to making a part of the tool that's accessible to us, the text of the New Testament. Can you at some point comment on that?
Yeah, well, I will say that, this book, this is not a massive book. This is a 150 page book, basically. So this is definitely something that you could pick up and read. I'd say it's fairly dense. It's not hard to read, but there's just a lot in it. But to your point, we've got basically, I would say 100, no, it's the main text is 172 pages. And that what they offer as a solution, which I take you to be looking for in the pages of the New Testament, starts on page 171. So we have basically 171 pages of problem and 1 page of solution.
I want to start with the solution at some point.
Well, and I can even, but if I can hold on to that.
Yeah, sure.
And maybe come back to it. And I'll try to sprint along a little more quickly here. Even because the factors that we're up against are profound, and they are difficult and just hard to solve. So in chapter 6, they ask people, okay, if you think racism is a problem, conservative evangelicals, not every conservative evangelical did say race is a problem. 80% said it was. They offered 4 different alternatives to what solutions might be pursued. And these 4: try to get to know people of another race, work against discrimination in the job market and in the legal system, work to racially integrate congregations, or work to racially integrate racial neighborhoods. So you might expect that most Protestant evangelicals would stress the first one: try to get to know people of another race. And then quantitatively, they really did show this. And that as you go farther through these more structural solutions, fewer and fewer evangelicals see this as something that can be done, or something to shoot for. And they even notice that cross-racial friendships, which is very much the sort of the promise keeper way of solving this problem, is definitely a good first step, but it is not, it by no means goes far enough, right? One or two, even relatively close cross-racial friendships they found did not have much effect on racializing attitudes. One of the things that they did find, and this was based on another sociological study, if a white person is part of an interracial network of relationships, it's not just kind of like one-off relationships, that makes a difference if you're a part of an interracial network. And it also makes a difference if those close relations that you have are with someone who is of equal or greater socioeconomic status than you yourself are, right? If it's a kind of a relationship that has a certain kind of asymmetry to it, where the sort of Black person is not necessarily the same socioeconomic class, that doesn't have quite the same brain re-altering effects that one of equal socioeconomic status does. So here again, they sum things up. Two factors most striking about evangelical solutions to racial problems: profoundly individualistic and interpersonal. They say, become a Christian, love your individual neighbors, establish a cross-race friendship, give individuals the right to pursue jobs and individual justice without discrimination by other individuals, ask forgiveness of individuals that one is wrong. Second, although several evangelicals discuss the personal sacrifice necessary to form friendships across race, their solutions do not require financial or cultural sacrifice. They do not advocate or support changes that might cause extensive discomfort or change their economic and cultural lives. In short, they maintain what is for them the non-costly status quo. So, Charlie, going back to your point, something that was going to look like a solution to this problem would have to attack, right, these last factors, cultural, economic factors that are much more intent or entrenched and difficult to change. It's not going to be something that can take place on a purely individual level. The next chapter, I won't even go into this. They spent some time talking about the fact, why is it so hard sociologically to maintain a mixed race congregation? So let's say you wanted to have, as a solution to the racialization of American society, you said, okay, racially homogeneous congregations are part of the problem, and we are gonna work really hard to found an interracial congregation. Why is that hard? Why are such experiments hard to maintain? And they say this with reference to a experiment in Seattle with an interracial congregation. And as they examine over a period of a couple of years how this very explicitly intentional interracial congregation was dedicated to the idea of an interracial faith community, gradually became monoracial. It actually became a Black congregation. And what were the factors that led to this? And they have several socioeconomic, or rather sociological explanations for this. I won't even go into these, but Gerardo Marti at Davidson College would be able to explain these in much greater detail, because these are all sociological factors and forces that sociologists can talk about and quantify. Homophily, the fact that people find it easier to be with people they perceive to be like themselves. Status quo bias, people tend to choose what they already have at the expense of some more ideal prospect that is sort of not yet in their possession. Niche edge effects, that groups lose members who are atypical of the group at a faster rate than other members. And you can see this at the level of social networks, and again, even quantitatively, that people who end up drifting to the edge of a group have fewer intergroup relationships, and as a result tend to sort of fall off the edge, and that competing groups actually become then more attractive to people at the edge of other groups. And the upshot is, for these very well-documented sociological reasons, it is hard to maintain, particularly in the American environment of a religious marketplace where people can move around and go to different places, that things just tend to sort themselves out racially. And it really requires a profound investment of energy to keep a group like that together. And that finally, groups that expend that kind of energy over time are less successful than groups that don't have to expend it. And this is, again, I think maybe going back to Charlie's question about, okay, what's a solution? What can we do? Can we explicitly, make it a point of, theological teaching and sort of important agenda to work on this racial issue, or to deal with more social conditions, to be a socially conscious activist kind of church, and that a focus on social conditions outside the group, in fact, you'd think could be a rallying point, but from a sociological perspective, it's costly. And C. Peter Wagner, who's actually a evangelical sociologist, as churches constitute themselves as agents to produce social change, they are likely to lose rather than to gain social strength. And then in a final chapter, actually this is the penultimate chapter, one of the ironies, they say, of religion's role is that in strengthening the micro bonds between individuals, like the small groups, the churches that hang together, religion contributes to within group, not group, but group homogeneity. It heightens isolation from different groups, reduces the opportunity of the formation of macro bonds between groups that serve to integrate a society. So what they're going for here, even if I haven't really managed to make a tight argument for it, is that some of the dynamics that make it hard to maintain an interracial group also contribute to the division of Black and white churches at the macro level. So in the final analysis, again, I'm thinking of Charlie and your comment, there's sociologically, there are just reasons why these are hard, these are hard things to maintain and hard to work against in the final analysis. And I think that's actually, I'll bring it to an end there. They do say, and I guess here maybe I'll read this little bit, here from page 172, evangelicals might then bring together this knowledge with Christian understanding of freedom, love, universalism, justice, unity, and community. Sounds like an organization in our midst, in fact. This can be done with the recognition that a Christian solution ought adequately to account for the complex of factors that generate and perpetuate the problems, and then faithfully, humbly, carefully, and cooperatively work against them. To do this will require attention to multiple factors, from historical forces to subcultural tools to the very organization of American religion. So I think what they do is, they perform a service here by really making clear and explicit the kinds of difficulties that you would have to deal with in really attacking the problem. Not just rely on superficial, hey, let's just get together and sort of pray and apologize and say we're sorry. That it's going to be harder. It's going to be harder than that. So I'm going to shut up there. We've still got a little bit of time for some open space, and I want to hear from folks if possible.
Can I tackle Charlie's question at least a little bit with the Davidson problem and maybe frame it? Part of the reason I think evangelicals can get away with their position is that there's a kernel of truth to the things that they believe, but they ignore a lot of other truths. So they tend to be either or binary thinkers instead of both and kind of thinkers, very conveniently sort of taking their anecdotes and experience. Say the baseball analogy of being born on third base. Indeed, if everybody was born on third base, the fastest runners would get home and score more runs than other people and earn a run. But there's a failure to recognize that some of us are not born on third base. Some of us don't even have a uniform and aren't even in the stadium. I mean, the degree of inequity is great. So in our town, if we tackle affordable housing, it's very difficult for us to level the playing field. It's structural, it's bigger than our town. But if we were going to write fair rules, then we would probably write rules that would take into account that there are some of us on the downhill side of an uneven playing field. We'd have rules that were different on the basis of where you were on the field. A lot of people who object to affordable housing solutions want to pretend the playing field is level. So they want the rules the same for the people on the uphill side and the downhill side. And they say those are fair rules. We should let the free market decide because that's meritocracy, that's fair rules. But the people on the downhill side get pushed out and gentrified by the people on the uphill side because the playing field is not level. So we in Davidson, we need to make different rules because we can't make the playing field level.
But it suddenly strikes me hearing you talk, Steve, that maybe one effective retort to that is the very bourgeois game of golf and the handicapping system. When if you get two golfers of very different abilities, the handicap is going to come into play, and that enables them to compete on a level. Whereas the better golfer is going to massacre the less able golfer, and that's why you got a handicap system. I'm not sure. Is that rhetorically effective? I don't know, but it suddenly just occurred to me as you were talking. One thing, Charlie, I'll throw this out again. I don't want to keep talking, but to your point, like, what are the resources of the New Testament for thinking about this? I feel like you and I have maybe talked about this just briefly, that there is in, I think, evangelical circles and Protestant circles generally, a way of thinking about Paul and Pauline theology that focuses much more on sort of individuals and sort of individual repentance and grace applied to the individuals, where in fact there's new ways of thinking about Paul, under this kind of apocalyptic framework of Christian Becker, that sees people not so much as individuals, but caught up in larger force fields, caught up in the force field of sin with a capital S, taken captive, held hostage. And that in this way of seeing things, it's less of a judicial paradigm where individuals pile up all kinds of sins and penalties that they can't pay off. And then Jesus, because of his perfect life, comes in with his perfect scorecard and pays the penalty that these sinful individuals have piled up. He sort of like pays off their credit card debt. And lo and behold, boom, they're saved. And they're grateful to him for that kind of transaction. In fact, that's the sort of a judicial way of thinking about forgiveness in Paul. And there's a more apocalyptic, large-scale way where Jesus is the factor that breaks down this sort of force field of sin, the flesh, and the devil, and that delivers people from its effects and sets them free. And that he does this not so much in this individual by individual kind of way. He does it in the form of his corporate body, the crucified body of Christ, of which people become a member. And that group identity is fundamental for Paul. It's not like the body of Christ is composed like pieces of Lego, right, out of individual Christians, and that somehow those are the fundamental building blocks. No, the body of Christ is the entity within which people have their particular identity, individual Christians. That's a kind of an abbreviated way of maybe bringing some New Testament resources to bear on your question, if that makes sense.
Thank you. I'm trying to follow your line there.
That's a little condensed, but after reading this book and just thinking a little bit more about some of the, all the talk about systems and systemic, that thinking about sin and the power of sin in those terms actually, I think, makes Paul relevant to this conversation.
Yeah, I think if you start with Adam in paradise, and the next step in totally understanding sin is Adam and Eve kicked out of paradise, there's a very, very long road to getting to what you're talking about. And I think, if you, excuse me, I don't want to go into that now. I mean, I can't go into it.
We can take that up on a side channel.
wouldn't an evangelical model of the body of Christ be a Lego model though, just by definition? I mean, there's just no way an evangelical wouldn't take the Lego model. That is what the body of
Yeah,
Christ.
no, I think, no, I'm not advocating the Lego model. I think the Lego model is the evangelical way of thinking about the body of Christ. And that it starts with the individual piece. And you hear this and you see this in the anecdotes in the book. All you got to do, and you hear this from Billy Graham, all you got to do is preach, is preach to them. And if they accept Jesus, they'll get their lives together, clean up their act. They'll be, successful economically. They'll be successful in their families. They'll adopt Christian principles, and everything will be fine. Right? That's the kind of typical abbreviated evangelical. And you're right, I think, to say that's not wrong, right? I mean, there's elements definitely of truth to that, but it's not, it's not an either or. It's not the whole picture, right? There are other things that are bearing down hard on people's ability to do what needs to be done. And, being born on third base as opposed to first or in the dugout is one way to think about it.
The other side of that coin is being held responsible and accountable for an individual's actions, as opposed to letting people off the hook on the basis of their victim status. And there's a fair amount of, rejection of sort of excuses and rationalizations for individual failure that I think are problematic from an evangelical point of view, in terms of that accountability piece of tool number one.
Greg, what strikes me is we need to think about a way of making the distinctions in Matthew 25, particularly those verses our church is focusing on. I think it's starting around verse 31, about the sheep and the goats, to make that somehow structural. That is to say, giving food, welcoming the stranger, that is not just an individual thing. That is something that institutions, particularly government, can do. We can have food stamp programs. We can have, we have to have some kind of national immigration policy. So let's make it humane. We have a prison system, so let's work on making that prison system humane. Too often, I think we've taken those Matthew 25 injunctions only on a personal level. And if we can bump it, if we can incorporate the structural into that.
Well, I think, some of the resource, the theological resources for doing that would be to, I think, go back and review and update some of the social gospel teachings that were out there at the end of the 19th and the beginning of the 20th century, right? That had a particular historical window that, in a sense, led up to FDR's New Deal policies, right? There would be things you would have to definitely update about that now, but that would be interesting to see who's trying to do that, if anyone is, and see what might be possible there. So to Charlie's point, there may be resources in the New Testament for thinking about it. There may be also resources even in the American theological tradition for thinking about what you just said.
Greg, it's an interesting bylight on the social gospel movement. Social gospel people, Rauschenbusch and others, were notoriously silent about the race situation.
Greg, you're going to need to consider the time and consider wrapping up the official section.
Oh, yes. Oh, we're at 10:47, aren't we? Okay. Well, maybe I can round it off here with a little prayer, and I'm fine to stick around and keep chatting. So we'll let me do that. Lord, thank you for the opportunity to meet and talk about these important subjects and get inside our minds and our hearts. Help us to think about these things, to work them out, and to be ready to make the sacrifices that are required. Amen.
Thank you, Greg.
Thanks, Greg.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Thank you, Greg.
Good.
Lots to think about.
Thank you.
Indeed, yeah, there is. There definitely is.